Our conversation should last, I would say, 45 minutes. So we'll have time to discuss all these matters. So our guest tonight is Eva Illouz. She's a sociologist, professor of, at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem and the École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales in Paris. She wrote several books, mostly translated into English, including Consuming the Romantic Utopia, Love and the Cultural Contradictions of Capitalism, called Intimacy, Intimacies, the Making of Emotional Capitalism, and also Why Love Hurts, a sociological explanation, to 2012, and Loving, a sociology of negative relations, which at the University Press, Oxford University Press, 2018. And Eva just published, I don't know if it's translated in English, not yet. Yes, it is the last one, the tract. No, not yet. So, the title in French is Le 8 octobre, généalogie d'une haine vertueuse. Say, well, October 8, genealogy of virtuous hatred. So, this event is in a partnership, and it's been sponsored by LICRA in the US, with this, its director, Martin Penck-Bernstein. NYU's Center for the Study of Antisemitism, director Avi Noam Fat. Avi is somewhere, I don't know. Yeah, okay, he just put it in front of me. And also the NYU's Top Center for Israeli Studies, director Lee Ben-Shipri. So, and the Department of Religion Studies at Princeton University, director of Judaic Studies, Leora Baditsky. So, let's start. Yesterday, Eva Illouz and Annette Viviorca initiated a collective column in the French newspaper Le Monde. The column denounces the extreme left's silence, denial, or indifference to the rise of anti-Semitism. And this text has been widely spread as if it has liberated a long repressed voice. The signatories claim they belong to the left, but feel betrayed by the left. So you, Eva Illouz, were a part of the left-wing movement, and you were, I don't know if you are still, committed to opposing the policies of the Israeli government. You even supported BDS, the boycott of Israel, and you will tell us if you still support the boycott of Israel. Then, October 7 happened. The massacre of 1,200 Israelis, most of them civilian, brutally killed by Hamas activists, and the 240 hostages taken to Gaza. Then, following your sentence, there was October 8. And what you describe as a lack of empathy for the Israeli population in the name of the legitimate Palestinian resistance. In an interview some days later, you pronounced this striking sentence: now we have to choose sides. Il faut choisir son camp. It has become impossible to support both sides, the solution of two states, for example, facing such hatred and barbarism. Then you wrote this book in which you analyze the lack of empathy towards the victim of October 7, and you made this diagnosis. There is a kind of virtuous anti-Semitism among progressives. And you drew the genealogy of the intellectual trends that have led to the denial of history, of facts, and the hatred of Israel and the Jews. So my first question, can you explain your shift, if it is a shift, from BDS to the support of one side and explain your analysis.
Thank you very much for this incredibly difficult question. I want to thank very much Martin and François for having me here today. So it's interesting that people think I've changed. No, I don't feel myself as having changed, and I will explain at length why. First of all, I think that after October 7th, I was simply reacting to an event in the strong sense of the word event. That is, I was absorbing the shock of a reality I was not exposed to beforehand. I think when an event deviates from what you thought before, I think you ought to rethink what you thought. It is an imperative for intellectuals to do it. That's simply a few words to introduce what I'm going to say. Now I want to say that I've never supported BDS. In fact, at Hebrew University, I think it was 2004, I spearheaded with someone called Aaron Ben-Avot a response to BDS. And I want to say why I opposed BDS. I opposed it because I thought it was unfair to target the population, that is the academics, that was already then targeted by the extreme right in Israel. I thought also it was not only unfair, I thought it was going to be very ineffective. Just to remind you, it is Israeli academics who share their knowledge about the Nakba. You know, what we know about the Nakba comes from Israeli academics. It is Israeli academics who came up with the notion of post-Zionism, and it is Israeli academics who have quite consistently promoted peace. So the Israeli Homo academicus resembles very much the Homo academicus in other countries. That is, it is solidly on the left. And so, for example, Shalom Achshav, the Peace Now movement, was actually founded in the 1970s by academics. So I confess that then the boycott of Israeli academics seemed to me like a kind of armchair activism. Then I would say that 20 years later, I can say that we have the proof that it was highly ineffective. It has neutralized, in fact, many of the people who would have been in the peace camp. And it has reinforced the view that Jews and that Israelis can only count on themselves and on their force in front of a hostile world. So I don't think the academic boycott has had an impact in Israel, and I don't think it has had a profound impact in the international arena in the sense of changing the Israeli policy. If anything, the Israeli policy has worsened and not improved. In fact, it has provoked a strong backlash, and it has had the effect of muddling the voice of moderate people and the voice of the pro-peace people inside Israel. What it has done outside of Israel is that it has polarized the extremes, and it has not proven to be a tactic for peace. If peace is indeed the goal of the BDS movement, I doubt it. Moreover, the BDS movement makes propositions with which I agree. For example, the idea that the occupation of the West Bank is illegal, that Palestinians are entitled to human rights which are denied to them by Israel, and entirely in agreement with those claims, but I disagree very much with other propositions, such as the demand of the return of all Palestinian refugees in Israel. We're talking about 5 million refugees, which would definitely alter the Jewish character of Israel. And finally, I completely disagree with the claim that Israel is a colonial state and that Zionism is racism. We will go back to these claims later, I believe. So, to remind you, the BDS movement emerged actually from the 2001 Durban conference that was organized by the United Nations, and which had initially claimed that Zionism is racism. That conference, for those of you who know the history of it, was a scandal because Nazi propaganda was harbored. I mean, it was very obviously displayed. And so I would say that the origins of the BDS movement are marred into this very disgraceful event. And finally, I would say that if the bombing and killing of Chechens by Russia in 1999 and 2000, just to take one example, or if the actions of China against 11 million Uyghurs, which were classified by the United States as a genocide, if that doesn't draw any boycott, we're entitled, I think, to ask why Israel alone would be boycotted. To say this is not to commit the sin of whataboutism, which is usually the standard response to this kind of claim. I think Israelis, like all groups, are entitled to ask whether they are treated differently by international organizations and, in the case that occupies us, by left-wing activists. In 2024, the UN condemned Israel 17 times, whereas the rest of the world combined, that is Iran and Turkey and China, whatever, the rest of the world combined got 6 condemnations. So for me, BDS inaugurated, if you want, a kind of demonization of Israel, which should worry us because it has made the discourse about Israel leave the realm of the political to enter another realm. And we'll discuss later what is that other realm. But it has made the word Zionist into a mark of infamy, into an insult, into something that marks you so profoundly that Zionists have been banned, harassed, vilified, and in my opinion, today the logic of BDS is a quasi-religious logic. It's not a political one. When we talk about, the symbolic world they move in my opinion, we're in the realm of angels and demons, of contamination and purity. However, I did defend, and I do defend still, the right of people to hold BDS positions without being sanctioned. So when the Germany's Bundestag decided, I quote, the Bundestag reaffirms its decision to ensure that no organizations or projects that spread anti-Semitism, question Israel's right to exist, call for a boycott of Israel, or actively support the boycott, divestment, with sanctions, BDS movement, they will not receive financial support. I understand where Germany is coming from. In my opinion, it is an overprotectiveness of the Jews. But again, I understand why Germany would do that, even though I find it counterproductive. I condemn much more the American states which punish employees or companies who subscribe to the boycott of Israeli companies or the BDS movement in general. I condemned it much more because I think these states don't have at least the historical excuse of Germany. I find it as simply a show of raw and brutal politics. So I'm strongly against the boycott on the one hand, but I oppose the criminalization of people who hold this position. You know Voltaire's famous word, I disapprove of what you say, but I will defend to the death your right to say it. So I simply defend the right to hold BDS positions, even though I am against it. Now I want to go back to your question of changing position, because that I think is also very important. When I lived in Israel, and I live from time to time in Israel, I think living in Israel and living in France entails fundamentally different positions. In Israel, as a Jew, I belong to the majority. In France, as a Jew, I belong to a tiny minority, 500,000 people in a population of 60 million, which is not even 1%. It's much less than 1%. So what changes when you are a majority is that you have a responsibility towards minorities. And in Israel, I feel a very strong responsibility vis-a-vis Arabs and Palestinians. And when I was living in Israel, I thought a lot about the ways in which Palestinians' rights must be defended because they were trampled over in a way that is indefensible. But in France, I think a lot about the hatred against the Jews. And as a member of a minority, I have a commitment to my people, especially when it is threatened. I think that any member of a minority understands what I mean by a commitment to my people. And these two opinions are not contradictory. Now think of I think everybody here probably knows the optical illusion of the old woman and the young woman, or the duck and the rabbit. You know this optical illusion. Now, what is interesting about the illusion is that when you see the duck, you cannot see the rabbit. And when you see the rabbit, you cannot see the duck. Or when you see the young woman, you cannot see the older one, even though they are both present at the same time. And so I think, in a way, this is what the mind should do. I think this is what we scholars or intellectuals, to use a slightly more pompous word, I think this is what we should do. In fact, be able to move from one image to another. And so it means that my ideas, like many people's ideas, are situated, and that your speech, the kind of speech you proffer, depends on the position you have in a particular society. October 7th happened when I was living in France, and I felt an overwhelming urge to participate in the grief and the dread of my people. So if you want, it was a change of location and not a change of opinion. And finally, to go back to the sentence that you quoted, you must choose your camp. So this was an interview I gave in Le Monde, and I ended by this sentence: you must choose your camp. And what I meant by that, and it was misunderstood, what I meant by that is that on October 7th, for the first time, you had to choose whether this was a crime against humanity or an act of heroic self-defense and resistance. You had to choose between being horrified at the systematic violation of bodies and human beings and thinking, as some progressives did, that actually some of it was invented, never happened, or that if it happened, it was not such a big deal, or that it was only justice. What I meant is that I did not see a third way between these two positions. And there were those who viewed the Hamas as a legitimate group, maybe as a reincarnation of the FLN, and those who view the Hamas as a fundamentalist group whose intent has been and remains the expulsion, submission, and elimination of Jews as Jews from Israel. These interpretations, I'm afraid, are not reconcilable. That's what I meant.
Okay, thank you. So I would say that in the past, So in the past, at least for people from my generation, anti-Semitism came always from the right wing. And it was unthinkable to question anti-Semitism from the left. Of course, we could discuss of a particular anti-Semitism of Marx or Jaurès, but the left was always fighting against anti-Semitism, the far right. And well, we could disagree with Zionism, but it doesn't mean that we were anti-Semite. But today, it looks like things have changed. The number of anti-Semitic acts has exploded in France, and many Jews are leaving the neighborhoods they've lived in since childhood. I can testimony of that. Well, anyway, I mean, from people from my family. So others are leaving France, and however, the left keeps silent. How do you explain it?
Thank you. That enables me to really say how I started, in fact, being so puzzled by what was happening, given that I had never worked on anti-Semitism. I was doing, I was interested in capitalism and the ways in which, I'm still interested in the ways in which capitalism transforms our inner life and emotional life. But so what struck me is not only the silence, but the utter lack of compassion. Compassion is a distinctly modern feeling, even though you can find it in Christianity and in religion, but culturally it really became prominent in the 18th century. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, for example, thought of compassion both as innate and universal. Not only innate and universal, but also involuntary. And this emotion came to be viewed by the Enlightenment as defining our humanity. And not only as defining our humanity, but it became a key aspect of what we call roughly, broadly, the liberal sensibility. And in fact, I would say that the left is often derided and mocked for having too much compassion and for not looking at the hard reality of politics and preferring compassion to it. So, if that is the centrality of compassion in our culture, and it is, if it is in fact the mark of the left. So I wanted to know, how is it that that camp lacked compassion? So I want to say demonstratively. It's not only that it kept silent, is that it was demonstrative in its lack of compassion. Just to give you a small, tiny point of comparison, when in 2014, 276 girls had been kidnapped by Boko Haram in Nigeria, the whole world said in a single breath, "Bring back our girls." And I emphasize the our girls. But here, Israelis seem to have been expelled from humanity. So much so, in fact, that many left-wing professors, I will not name them, as late as March, doubted that there had ever been violence against women. And the expression, when I said demonstrative, what I mean, there were lots and lots of examples. On October 8th, for example, Bret Stephens from the New York Times went to a gathering in New York City, and he said that what he saw was only giddiness. In Brighton, in the UK, the same thing happened. People were overjoyed and expressed their joy. In Berlin, in Sonnenallee, people actually gave baklava to celebrate the event. In France, lots of Facebook pages or X pages expressed also very overtly their joy. So that, for me, was a puzzle. How come? And I think this is a question that the philosopher Paul Zavatsky formulated, not about the October 7th, in general terms. He said, when compassion disappears, it is an enigma which we must decipher. How is it that an emotion that is so much a part of the normative fabric of our culture becomes absent? To explain this simply by anti-Semitism or even anti-Zionism, in my opinion, doesn't explain much. Because if you explain anti-Semitism by anti-Semitism, you remain tautological. In my opinion, you need to understand two things. One is the ideological process by which Israel has become dehumanized, that is, process by which these people who were killed savagely were not counted anymore among human beings that we can empathize with. How Israel has become dehumanized, depoliticized, and dehistoricized in order to become a kind of abstract symbol of a radical evil. And so that's the first question that I asked myself. And the second question, which is no less important, is to understand how those same people do not feel anti-Semitic. So, I'm a sociologist, and I belong to the strand of sociology that is called comprehensive sociology. That is, comprehensive sociology wants always to understand a phenomenon by the ways in which people themselves explain it. Given that so many of our morally pure progressives do not feel anti-Semitic, it is important to explain the two things at the same time. And so, if you want, we need to explain this kind of gap between the intentions or the meanings that these people espouse on the one hand, and the effects. The explanation that I give is ideological. I don't explain hatred by hatred. I explain it by ideologies. That is, when I say ideologies, I mean a set of ideas. And here, I think that what we have witnessed is a kind of perfect storm. It was the encounter of very many different ideologies that were in the doing for the last 50, 70 years, and that went kind of undetected. For example, and I cannot elaborate, but for example, the Soviet Union started very early on offices in Zionology. The purpose of this work was to delegitimize entirely Zionism, and in fact, Soviets were the first to invent this idea that Zionism is racism. I only remind you, you know, in 1952, the anti-Semitic Slansky trial in Czechoslovakia against Jewish members of the Communist Party. And this was one of the first times where they were called Zionist and imperialist, if you want. They were aligned in the same sentence. And being Zionist and imperialist was enough to send them to their execution. So Soviet propaganda using all kinds of channels, embassies, Novosti, and their connections with the communist parties of the world, Soviet propaganda played a very big role in making Zionism into a synonym of imperialism and racism, which would prove to be keywords in the lexicon of the left. Then there is the Arab anti-Semitic propaganda. So early on, 1930s, the founders of the Muslim Brotherhood, Al-Qutb and Hassan al-Banna, and later, slightly later, Amin al-Husseini, were deeply inspired by Nazi ideology. They were fascinated with Hitler, and especially with his program of ridding the world with Jews. So they politicized what had been a theological anti-Semitism contained in Islam, but which was often not acted upon. There was, if you want, a kind of conflation here of Nazi propaganda and content in Islam. And the pan-Arabism of Nasser only echoed and amplified this kind of anti-Semitism. I mean, I go very quickly, of course, because I want you to read the book. And then I would say third is something that happens a bit later, I would say in the 1990s and 2000, which is the emergence of the decolonial discourse, which actually echoed with, for example, Nasser's view that he was an anti-imperialist. Decolonial discourse has a decolonialism is not post-colonialism, by the way, because what characterizes decolonialism is the view that colonialism is an enduring structure, even though, let's say, colonialism has officially ended. They view it as an enduring structure that both the colonialists and the colonized, the formerly colonized, carry in them. Structure, it's a very key word here. What it means, if it is a structure, it means that it can be replicated from one context to another, and that even a non-colonial country can remain colonial unknowingly, and that, in fact, Israel also, what you did was to project on Israel a history that was not its own history. As Patrick Wolf, who was one of the founders of the field of settler colonialism, said, settler colonialism is not an event, it's a structure. So again, if it is a structure, that means you are dispensed, you are exempted from the need to look at the particular history of the place to which you apply this notion. And then the fourth, if you want, this is like a layered cake. So it has many layers, and then you can eat it, and it's really good. So the fourth element is that all of these ideology could not coalesce so well in the West if there had not been, if minorities had not become a chief topic in Western countries. And if there had not been, in fact, a competition, I mean, two things happened. One was Islamic, for example, in France, Islamic or Muslim minorities were made to replace the proletariat. They were viewed now as a kind of universal class. You remember that in Marxism, the proletariat is the universal class. So if you free and you emancipate the proletariat, you emancipate the entire humanity. That is the basic view of history of Marx. But then they substituted Muslim minorities who were indeed exploited and who were indeed the victim of discrimination and racism. They replaced the proletariat with the minorities inside democracies. And so you had an extraordinary, I would say, convergence of interests and discourses. And this is how anti-Zionism and anti-colonialism became what Jean Amuret, the great Austrian essayist, who wrote At the Mind's Limit, among others, called a virtuous anti-Semitism. That is, it is an anti-Semitism that gives to the progressive left the right to do what it would not do for any other minority, which is to despise and dismiss one of the core values of the Jews, which is Zionism. Zionism is absolutely fundamental to many Jews, not all Jews, but many Jews, and it gave them the right to do that when, in fact, they did not do that for any other minority. So virtuous hatred is, if you want, it's a way of experiencing your morality. This is the reason why what I call these anti-Semites, do not feel themselves as anti-Semites. Because anti-Semitism is not, in my opinion, it is not a heterophobia. It is not a fear of the other. Not at all. I think it is a way of experiencing your morality, and this has been always the case. When Christians killed Jews because they accused them of ritual murder, of course they thought they were defending Christian morality. In fact, quite often when they killed someone, they erected a church or pilgrimage site where the presumed child had been killed by the Jews. Socialists viewed in Jews what they hated most. That is, they viewed them as embodying the power of money and banking and greed. The extreme nationalist right viewed Jews as ruthless cosmopolitans. That means that in all these cases, what these groups are doing is affirming their values through the Jews. So the Jews is a kind of mirror, if you want, it's the moral inverted mirror of the West, of many groups in the West, enabling those various groups to experience their own morality. And now we arrived to Israel. Israel is today, in my opinion, anti-Zionism, in my opinion, is the ways in which a good part of the progressive left feels its own morality by demonizing this country.
Okay, so I have 10 questions, but I think I will keep just 4 or 5. It's la Maison Française, so let me focus for one question on the situation in France. My third question would be, is there a specific history of the French left with the Jews? Has anti-Semitism always been present in specific leftist movements, or has it emerged only recently? Just let's recall a few famous figures among French Jews committed to the extreme left, and whom our American friends perhaps may not know. One of the most famous was Benny Lévy in the 1970s. He was a revolutionary leader of La Gauche Prolétarienne, who had significant intellectual influence, and then he decided to abandon politics to turn to the study of Hebrew and Talmud. He said that he realized that in the support of the Fedayeen, that was the word we used at that time, the Fedayeen, there was also anti-Semitism. Then in early 2000, books began to document the hatred of Jews in Arab immigrant neighborhoods, and their they were left-wing authors, were cancelled. Another prominent figure, Jean-Claude Miner, who was a Maoist activist, published a book in 2003 that provoked a great debate in France, entitled Les penchants criminels de l'Europe démocratique, the criminal tendencies of the democratic Europe. And in it, he explained the structural anti-Semitism of the French left, from the Captain Dreyfus trial at the end of the 19th century, to the French collaboration with Nazism, and to third structure, the same structure, but third step, the hatred of Israel today. So we could trace the genealogy of this disillusion. Recently, a book has been published by Bruno Carsanti, Une grande désillusion. This disillusion among the left-wing Jews, who little by little realized that the left perhaps doesn't love them. So are you part of this long series of Jews who were completely disappointed by the left wing?
So if you know a bit of history, we should not have been. Although I have to say, if your question is about France, I think we should be much more nuanced than maybe in other countries. So, first of all, France was the first to emancipate the Jews, historically. And not only it emancipated the Jews, but it had a Léon Blum at the head of the French state when France was deeply anti-Semitic, which, despite the very small numbers of Jews in France then, was never equaled in tolerant America. You never had a head of government, certainly not a century ago, in America. So I just want to say this for the record. At the same time, it remains incontrovertible that a good part of the left, the anarchists said, that Jews did not belong to the human race. Even Jean Jaurès, the great Jean Jaurès, came very reluctantly to the Dreyfus affair because he thought that Dreyfus was a Jew and not worthwhile to defend. Jules Gued, who represented the French Workers' Party, also explained that he did not want to join the Dreyfus affair because he was a military Jew and that he belonged to the ranks of the bourgeoisie. However, what happened in France was that, and this is precisely what the Dreyfus affair managed to do, what the Dreyfus affair managed to do, while there were a lot of left-wing people who were anti-Semitic, the Dreyfus affair drew a new line. And the new line was that anti-Semitism became much more a characteristic of the Catholics and the ultra-nationalist and anti-Semitic extreme right. So in a way, the Jews here had the left constitute itself as anti-Semitic. Moreover, this became particularly true after World War II, where there was a kind of consensus that the left embraced, and which was that the left defended all minorities, and in fact, the defense of Jews after the Shoah became, in a way, the paradigm for defending all minorities. This is why, by the way, in France and in America, I believe, you have a majority of Jews voting very solidly for the socialists, because the socialists were Philo-Semites. So the Jews have been historically on the left, and the left was on the side of the Jews. Yet we know that there are two lefts. One that is, we can call it reformist, and one we can call revolutionary, if you want. The revolutionary left has, in my opinion, a kind of morbid fascination for violence. As you said, Francois, in the 1970s, the revolutionary left had many contacts with the Fedayins, the Palestinians, and many of their members went actually to form themselves and to learn how to use weapons. They went into training camps in Jordan. And this is when the myth of the Palestinian as resistant got formed. And I think that, in fact, before we had the image of the Israeli as a Nazi, had the image of the Palestinian as a resistant. I think it preceded the image of the Israeli of the Nazi. And so Israel slowly and obviously was made to look reactionary. And what is new today is that for the first time since the Dreyfus affair, and this is a dramatic change in my opinion, is that Jews have become again the topic on which political parties and political factions divide themselves. And I don't see any precedent except in the Dreyfus affair. It is the return of the Jews as a topic which divides politicians and politics. And so you have, and especially on the left, so you have the left of Raphael Glucksmann, who is social democrat and Europhile, and you have La France Insoumise, who caters to the Muslims. You have Barack Obama on the one hand, and you have Judith Butler, or you have Keir Starmer and Jeremy Corbyn. And this is a very deep fracture inside the left, and I don't think it can be right now overcome. And so I think that I belong to the left, and I think we belong to radically different camps. When you consider that somebody like Mélenchon, who is the head of the extreme left party, supports people like Chavez or Lula or Maduro, who are aligned in the same camp as Putin or Iran, it is clear that we are no longer in the same camp. And so I think that we're talking about a shift in the tectonic plates of the global order and of the left. And once again, one more time, it is the Jews who are at the center of this enormous crisis, which is also the crisis of democracy, and which is also the crisis of the Western Bloc. And so the left, there is a left that doesn't demonize Israel and a left that does demonize Israel. And there is a left that demonizes the West and a left that wants to be a part of the West. And interestingly enough, these two camps, in my opinion, overlap completely. So what I'm saying is that the Jews are actually giving voice or expressing, or through the Jews, we are expressing this profound fracture, which in itself reflects the change of the global order. I think that the sign that the LFI in France is morally bankrupt is that instead of remaining faithful to the left-wing tradition of defending all minorities, the LFI has taken one side, which is the side of the Muslim minorities, by excusing and legitimizing the terrorist actions of the Hamas and by never expressing its compassion for the Jews. And so it is now playing the role of pitting minorities against each other and has made anti-Zionism into its defining platform. Jews, again, are at the center of political debate. This is very worrisome.
Okay, so I think that will be my last question. So really, but I want to give a space also time for discussion with all of you. So your answer was about the political shift between two left. But the main point of your book is about also the intellectual trends, also the intellectual movements in the last 50 years. And well, if I may, I think that you embrace very largely all these movements, And so you have kind of sign, yeah, I'm still on the left, you know. But when we see your critics of all this movement, we question, you know, on what side you are, because, well, if I quote all these references, you have this kind of package with, you know, the deconstruction, French theory, decolonialism studies, postcolonial, Marxist sociology, identity politics, Green Party. You know, so it sounds like really, and it's not, well, it's not an issue, but it sounds really like, you know, here, you know, the condemnation of all this movement in the academy. Well, so well, my question is, well, in the name of what, you know, you criticize all this intellectual movement? On what theoretical basis do you criticize them? Do you call for what? For a return to universalism, republicanism, or to something that was better before all what, you know? And I think it's difficult to be back, to return to this time after this movement, you know, brought to us, you know, intellectually. So I would like you to explain why you construct this package of all the responsibilities coming from these very different intellectual movements.
So I hope you don't mind if I give another slightly long answer.
Yeah. Then I give up with my question. So yeah, for sure. Take your time.
So first of all, I approach the left as an anthropologist. I don't think we should be intimidated by the fact that groups present themselves as political groups to excuse them from the analysis that we normally as sociologists and anthropologists exercise on all groups. So I view the left, first of all, as a group with interests. It could not be otherwise there would not be human beings. Every human being, especially when their groups have interests. And so in the book, I trace the interest of the class of academics which came up with a view of the world in which structure and power, what I call powerism, became so powerful. And I try to explain what type of professional interests were invested in the particular development of and use of deconstruction in academia, but I cannot here elaborate. And I think I had to look at the convergence of all these different ideologies to understand how Israel became what Roland Barthes called a mythology. So you remember in that marvelous book, Barthes analyzes all kinds of mythologies, and he analyzes the mythology of professional wrestling. And he compares it to boxing, and he says the aim of wrestling, it is the aim of theatrical stunt fighting is not to discover who will win or a demonstration of excellence. It is a staged spectacle acting out society's basic concepts of good and evil, of suffering, of defeat, and of justice. End of quote. So this is, I think, exactly what is happening with this new mythology that we call Israel. It is a symbol, it is a morality play, it is a metonymy for evil, and it is, it is a way for expressing suffering, defeat, and justice. So why? Because you have a convergence of different ideologies. And here I want to go back to something that is very dear to me, which is Adorno's notion of anti-Semitism. Adorno, the pioneer of critical theory, Marxist political critical theory. Adorno's view of anti-Semitism is very interesting, I think, and original and very relevant for our times. If you remember, he wondered about the persistence of anti-Semitism in a society that was officially and institutionally no longer anti-Semitic. And he suggested the concept of ticket to understand what was at work in anti-Semitism. Ticket not in the sense of a ticket you buy in a bus, but in the sense of an electoral ticket, that is a whole package. And he says this ticket contains or is characterized by 4 elements. The first one is that anti-Semitism, he says, is no longer an opinion, an isolated opinion, but it is a part of an ideological conglomerate. I love this expression. So you have a fascist conglomerate. Now I think you have a progressive conglomerate. It is a ticket. Second, he says, anti-Semitism is not a personal conviction or opinion. Rather, it is what enables you to join a camp that is already well constituted and a camp that stereotypes values, which forgoes nuance and complexity. Third, he says ideology comes in the form of ideological clusters, and it gives rise to what he calls ticket mentalitat, that is a mentality which characterizes these ideologies from the right and from the left, and which consists in a depersonalization of thinking, an espousal en bloc of ideologies, which in turn atrophies and stifles the very capacity to judge. For example, think of these clusters, think of the fact that queer and feminism actually associated themselves with anti-Zionism. They come today as a package, as a cluster. It's a series of clusters, and you want to belong to these clusters. And finally, and this might be the most perhaps interesting and provocative claim of his argumentation, he says, the fact that there are no longer anti-Semitic opinions does not mean there is no longer anti-Semitism. That I found really arresting. And what I take from what he says, and from my own analysis, if you like, is that the intersection of very many different forms of thinking does not produce at all a very sophisticated way of thinking. On the contrary, this is what Adorno is actually suggesting. It is, he says, it produces a very simple form of thinking, and in fact, it produces a form of thinking that can no longer judge. It can no longer express the faculty of judgment. And so, for example, I will not quote him by name, but you have an American, very well-known essayist who spent 2 weeks in the West Bank, and 2 weeks were enough for him to come back thinking that he understood it all, and that he, you know, the idea that it was complex, as he said, was all horse shit. Unquote him. So this is what I call fast thought. Fast thought as fast food. It's fast thought. It is something that you consume very easily. It is something that you produce very easily. And it is a mode of thinking that disregards truth, history, facts, and mostly it disregards complexity. And so here, if this is the last question, I want to end with a quote by Edgar Morin. Edgar Morin defines holism. He says, holism is a partial, one-dimensional, and simplifying vision of the whole. Holism is essentially the reduction of complexity to a master concept. Complexity, in contrast, dissolves abstraction and ready-made categories. It enables detail and contradiction to emerge. And so to the idea of totality, that there is, you know, these big demonic entities, so Israel as a single total phenomenon, we should substitute the idea which Morin suggests, not in the context of Israel, by the way, he's totally anti-Zionist, but in the, he proposes this idea of confluence which is an aggregate of several different phenomena. And to use Morin's beautiful analogy, he says, using totality is like going to fish, but find only fish bone and not the fish itself. Complexity is what helps see the fish, the flesh, its bones, and the ocean. So that means that, in fact, what I'm calling for, since this was your question, I'm calling for complexity and I'm calling for history in our judgment. I am against the use of myth and mythologies which substitute for judgment. That means, for example, that we should be able to think at one and the same time that Israel was colonialist and anti-colonialist, that Jews were actually natives who were struggling with other natives, that Jews may have been violent and racist and had a complete moral, political, and historical right to this tiny piece of land, and that they were oppressors, indeed, but they were also profoundly oppressed. Thank you.
So it's time for question. This one, yeah, here.
Thank you. Oh, you got that. So you've been in a masterful analysis of anti-Semitism, primarily among the intellectual class of the left. At the same time, Jewish students are profoundly unsafe in public schools. They're abandoning the public schools en masse. They're leaving neighborhoods, as you mentioned at the beginning. Synagogues, as well as Jewish schools, are under police protection. So there's this confluence of ideologies, absolutely, but there's just anti-Semitism in its original form in France, which is an ugly fact that makes me upset and very uncomfortable, but you can't get around it. So could you respond to that?
In France, more than in the United States?
Oh,
No.
you know, in my opinion, yes. Okay, Jewish, yeah, I mean, well, I mean, you respond to that as you see fit.
Okay. So I will respond to your question in two parts.
Sure.
And I will contradict myself, but this is what I like to do. Say one thing and its opposites.
Okay.
So in my opinion, anti-Semitism is the criminalization of Jews. I think it's essentially that. It's both giving Jews a power, a superpower, and making them uber criminals. I think it has its source. I don't think it has its source as is usually accepted in the rivalry, in the theological rivalry between Christianity and Judaism on the question of who was first and who is right. I don't think so. I think that deicide, the idea that you killed, that you committed the worst crime on earth, which is killing the God. And in a way, you can say that the ritual murder afterwards, the accusation of ritual murders, which were responsible, for example, for the expelling the Jews from England in the 13th century, is a much more plausible way to explain anti-Semitism. And so fundamentally, I think Jews are viewed as dangers to the civilization. This is why you have a straight line from this kind of Christian anti-Jewish Judaism to the Protocol of the Sages of Zion, which was written in Russia at the very beginning of the 20th century, because the Protocol of the Sages of Zion is about the Jews being about to take possession of the world and destroy it. So I don't think we can really understand anti-Semitism if we do not understand that that Jews have both these attributes of of power and of criminality. So, and if you ask me whether these can be found in the ways in which Israel is looked at, yes, absolutely. Yeah. 3 days after the October 7th, 3 days after, what was his name? Riyad Mansour at the UN spoke about the genocide. We were on October 10th. Mm-hmm. And the reason why I believe the word genocide caught so well and it fitted like a glove is because, again, in the context of the extraordinary criminality with which we have attributed to the Jews. I will add also something else, which is that in the 19th century, many anti-Semites say that they are not anti-Semites. They harbor no hatred to the Jews. So take Wilhelm Marr. Wilhelm Marr is the one who coined the anti-Semitism, the notion of anti-Semitism. He was himself a very enthusiastic anti-Semitic. He created the leagues of anti-Semitism, and he writes, "I have no hatred in my heart for the Jews. However, what I am concerned about is their deleterious effects on society." So this is social anti-Semitism. And I think that what we are witnessing is a kind of development or new version of this form of social anti-Semitism, which says, I have no hatred, but I'm concerned about what the Jews might do. So, in that respect, I agree with you. However, allow me to, I will just say this, allow me to make the case defending France. There is what in France we call a Republican front. A Republican front meaning a group of people, Arabs, Jews, non-Jews, who are united in their desire to defend the values of the Republic and to overcome this kind of hatred that has been sowed. Personally, my view is with regard with what needs to be done is that I think, in the same way maybe that African Americans at some point understood that universalism did not represent them, or that the colonized understood that this notion of universalism did not represent them, but they went into the conclusion that it should reject it altogether. I think Jews and Arabs, the Arabs who live in Israel and the Arabs who live in democracies, should reconstruct together social democracy. Why do I say Arabs? Because I think there are many Arabs who are as wary of identity politics and who understand there is also some kind of affinity between anti-Semitism towards them and towards the Jews and the Islamophobia that exists also in France. So allow me to say that I have found France to be resisting in particularly magnificent way what has been happening.
So there are 3 questions now. You can shorten a little bit your question because there are many here.
So you mentioned it,
The second one,
yes,
and the third one.
And Adorno, can you extrapolate a bit on Daniel Kahneman and cognitive ease that you bring up in your book? And
I think you read me.
Yeah, of course I read it in French, it's right here. I hope it's translated soon because it's really powerful. It's a beautiful little book, very thin, really wonderful. I hope it comes out in America soon.
So I one notion I did not mention here, which completely rejoins Adorno's view on anti-Semitism, which is developed by David Nirenberg, the great David Nirenberg, in his study of anti-Semitism. The notion that David uses is the notion of cognitive comfort. He says anti-Semitism is, and it is really congruent with what Adorno is saying. He says it is really a way of explaining reality in a very, very simple way. And so this is when, I mean, I was not happy with this notion of comfort, which seemed to me a little bit vague. So I went to the marvelous works of Daniel Kahneman, which distinguishes between what he calls system of thinking 1 and system of thinking 2, which are slow thinking and fast thinking. And it's a, I think, much better way to build a dichotomy than the one we put between reason and emotion. He substitutes for that familiar dichotomy, he substitutes another one, which is slow thinking and fast thinking. And so I went to fast thinking and I discovered, it's a big word, but I wanted to show that a lot of the judgments that are made about Israel proceed actually from what he calls the fast thinking. And I have a whole chapter which I cannot get into now, and also I don't remember it, I forget everything I write, but in which I detail all the rhetoric strategies in order to simplify a great deal reality and also to make it emotionally very powerful.
I'll hold on.
Okay. Hello, yes, thank you. I wanted to start, I guess, by offering maybe a solution, a potential solution to one of the riddles that you posed, and then also finish with a question. The solution or potential solution being to your question about the compassion of the left and where was it on October 8th, for instance. My answer would be, and speaking as a Jew, this compassion of the left and of most of the world were with the Palestinian people who had been the victims of what many groups, B'Tselem, Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, etc., had been under apartheid, and therefore they were the primary recipients of the compassion of the left as the subaltern, if you will, and that at times compassion can be mutually exclusive. For instance, when one party is clearly the dominator and the other is the dominated. So that's a solution, and I think the answer is kind of the fact that your ability to have compassion is itself clearly somewhat, somewhat, I don't want to say stunted, but clearly in difficulty if you cannot see that simple fact. And so that's a solution that I propose. And the question that I had for you is that in light of the fact that you seem to be hostile to the going concern on the left in France, and yet in the La France Insoumise, and also a member of the left in Israel, where the left is completely prostrate to the point of non-existence electorally and in the broader public and intellectually, I would venture, although you're more equipped to speak to that than I. And then also the fact that your book seems to be about something like the new anti-Semitism, which has been a topic broached since like the mid-70s, when you had members of the ADL talking about anti-Semitism on the left, usually concurrent with crises of Zionism. So in light of those three things, what makes you think that you have the basis, or that anyone should necessarily lend credence to your views on this topic?
I don't. I really don't have to believe me. I mean, really, you don't have to believe me. I built my argument in such a way. Either it convinces you or it doesn't. And I believe that you know, we might start from such different premises that I might not be able to convince you. So with regard to the compassion issue, Gaza had been given back in 2005.
Under blockade.
It was under blockade, but the blockade was much weaker. And it was so weak, in fact, that Netanyahu had the brilliant idea of transferring millions, hundreds of millions of dollars, thinking, and I believe he was stupid enough to think that, thinking that this would help actually alleviate the misery or the difficulties that the Palestinians were having. You know, this is, so if you look at Gaza, I'm not going able to convince you that the withdrawal of Gaza was a very significant gesture from the side, on the side of the Israelis, and that it is not implausible at all to have imagined that people would have built itself in such a way as to want to be economically flourishing and with the hope of making peace one day with these terrible neighbors. It's not what happened. Instead, they built 700 kilometers of tunnels and amassed a vast arsenal. So I don't think that the Gazans are the right targets for compassion. If they are, I have no less compassion for the Gazans who were victims of the Hamas itself, as much as of the Israelis. So just let me finish. Let me finish.
The United Nations, reaffirmation of armed struggle as a valid.
Finish.
Okay, we're gonna just take a moment
Just
here.
let me finish.
Please answer my question.
I didn't hear it, first of all. I did not
She was
hear it.
shouting, which is probably.
The second thing about compassion is I have compassion, tremendous compassion for the Palestinians whose lives have been destroyed and for Gaza who has been destroyed. I can have also compassion for my people. I don't think compassion is a zero-sum game at all. I think you can have actually compassion for two groups. There was nothing that prevented so many of these people, Nan Goldin the first, to be revolted by what had happened and then to start expressing her deep sorrow or a disagreement on October 27th when the ground operation started. But they did not even wait for the ground operation to start. It happened on October 8th already. And also do not forget that the ways in which these people were killed is not just any killing. It was what I would call a kind of new regime of atrocity, because it was live, because it was intent on inflicting maximum pain and torture, killing children in front of parents and parents in front of children. So that I think was so extreme, the ways in which it was performed was so extreme that I think it warranted for 24 short hours some gesture of compassion, even if you wanted to take it somewhere else afterwards. Yeah, so compassion is not a zero-sum game. You can have it for more than one group.
Does that justify the killing of mothers and children in Gaza?
We're going to move on.
Yeah, see if I may remember a sentence by Albert Camus. So there is no balance between victims, there is only addition of all victims.
Who's doing the adding at the moment?
Lillian, on you.
Is some of what's going on with anti-Semitism, does it reflect the intellectual weaknesses of what's considered a left? I mean, there are anti-Zionist thinkers like Abraham Leone and Isaac Deutscher, who were quite anti-Zionist, but they had a class analysis, and they viewed anti-Semitism in terms of roles that Jews played in the economy, and they clearly came to the conclusion, no, Jews did not control the capitalist system. They played an entrepreneurial role in medieval economies, and it affected their occupational structure, but they were not in control of the economy, of the capitalist economies, and because of the fact they were associated with business and commerce and were an outcast people, they were the supreme scapegoats for all the ills of capitalism. And it seems that that has not really been translated into contemporary Marxism. Also, identity politics, it's always us against them, and oftentimes oppressed groups have a relationship, and one groups of oppressions related to another groups of oppression. I see that in the left now, where white working class people who are really suffering as a result of anti-Black racism because of the lack of unity that it creates in the way it divides people. It's just an analysis. They're just beneficiaries of light skin privilege. But in a way, they're really hurt by anti-Black racism because it really ruins the unity of working class people. So I see like a bastardization of a class analysis and some sort of identity politics, which doesn't see an interconnectedness between people who have suffered and their relation between each other.
As we reach the end of this discussion, please, people who would like to ask a question, raise your hand, please. And then we can perhaps take all this question and you answer if you want to as well. Okay. So there was first this lady. Yeah. And then this person, please.
Okay. So are we going to bundle it together?
We'll take all the questions for last round.
Not too much. Just to say.
I just want to point out that the October 8th was this day after we saw it in London, where the anti-Zionist demonstrations or anti-Israel demonstrations happened within hours of Hamas's assault. They applied for a demonstration permit. We saw it at Harvard. We've seen it again and again. And I just want to say that the exchange that took place exemplifies to me precisely your point, that we're dealing here with kinds of theologies, and that words will not matter, and the polemics will go on and on and on, and will do no good for anybody on the ground, but just this recycling of recriminations and polemics. And I think that the left that you call the progressive left, I think in the United States is filtered through a kind of MAGA behavior. So they're not so much anymore left, but they're occupying campus buildings or invading campus buildings like the January 6th rioters. The level of repudiation of basic facts is absolutely on par with Trumpism. And I just want to thank you for your courage in speaking out.
Hi, thank you so much for speaking tonight. Just a quick question that has nothing to do with what they were just saying. But to go back to your phonological approach and what you were saying about ideological clusters. So I think in my experience, as well as those who I know both in France and the United States, the silence of the left with regard to the hostage crisis, for example, is driving a lot of Jewish people to the right, which arguably is equally as dangerous. But in a way, I think the ideological clusters are what prevents people from giving up on the left, because they're like, well, I stand with all these other values, so I can't just necessarily abandon that. So I guess, I don't know if you have a response to that, or just sort of pushing back on this idea of the ticket.
So your question is about the move of the Jews to the right.
Yeah, and just like the ideological clusters as not necessarily bad, I guess.
So I think for me today, I am going to use a kind of emphatic claim, but it seems to me that the Jewish people faces an unprecedented crisis. I think maybe there has never been, I mean, a pogrom or even a Shoah is not a crisis, it is a catastrophe, so it's not a crisis. The reason why I think it is a crisis is that the Jews are caught between the extreme right, which seems to be more and more tempting and appealing, and a left that is no longer accepting them.
That's a good question.
And so the Jews are actually finding themselves. I think even, you know, Israel, which was a place that you could think of as a refuge for the Jews, I'm just raising the possibility, may not be any longer or not for long a refuge, in the sense that it is quite possible that it is going to be, it is already kidnapped, and it might be further kidnapped by people who are at the opposite of Zionist socialism that created the country. And so in front of, so you have this on the one hand, and you have the democratic liberal forces on which the Jews have always counted and which are no longer there to protect them. And I think if there is a dramatic change that has happened after October 7, it is that this idea that democracy will always protect us, and I think we all believe that liberalism or democracy would protect us, we can no longer tell this story to ourselves. But the alternatives are non-existing, or if they are existing, are as bad as what is happening. So in France, as you may perhaps know, during the European election, there was a poll by some well-known Jews that if there was hesitation between a candidate from the LFI, the anti-Semitic LFI, and the extreme right, they said, vote for the right, for the extreme right. And that is the sign, in fact, in my opinion, that Jews are enacting the profound crisis of democracy. I take this not to be only the crisis of the Jews. I take it as to be the unraveling of democracy itself around the topic of the Jews. So that's why I really like this metaphor of the canary in the coal mine. So if you want to know if the coal mine is livable or not, you bring down the canary and you see if it survives or not. And if it does not survive, it means the coal mine is not practicable for human beings. And Jews, in a way, are at the avant-garde of the disasters of the world. And that is what I feel is being played out right now. So it concerns us, but it concerns the rest of the world.
So let me say just a final word. I'm really happy you're here, and I thank you for your very respectful behavior. Because many of my colleagues told me, you are completely crazy to organize this session. It will be chaotic, this disruption, and I would like to thank my partners, my partnership, because that made it possible. I would like to thank you very much. I'm very happy that it was possible and to listen to Eva. So thank you all and thank you, Eva.